So leading on from a video that we done recently on one of the Thames tributaries, I went targeting barbel rolling bread, and I know I spoke quite extensively about that and very briefly touched on rolling meat. That brings us on to the River Team. It's a beautiful bit of water, as you will see, pretty wild, very raw. Coming here to do some rolling meat is probably the best way to approach this for somewhere that I've never been before or have very little knowledge of. Being able to work out where hold-ups might be, try and work out the topography, and especially with the river as low as it is now, actually able to see parts of the riverbed that I would not get the opportunity to during the winter. In doing so, I'm going to be using a pretty similar setup as you saw in the previous visit, and that is going to be using one of my trusty centre pins with the 1 pound 5 test curve barbel rod. Fluorocarbon hook link, probably around about a foot and a half long, which is then just tied straight onto the 10-pound main line. On the business end, very simple, just using a size 4 or a size 6 XT barbel hook. That's just so that I can fish an array of size, different bits of luncheon meat. You don't want to use a too small a hook, because there have been times when actually I've not been able to keep the bait on properly for a long period of time. There's plenty of different options that you can use. Certainly I know anglers who use like weighted hooks, but I do tend to actually just use just normal split shot that you can pick up from the shop, and that just allows me just to change through the fall rate, and also when you're fishing different swims as well, is you find that they have different paces, different topography, so you've got to kind of read the water and use your watercraft as to actually how much weight you need in order for the bait to fall, but equally not too much that it holds bottom and doesn't actually move through naturally with the flow, because quite often, especially with barbel where there's no real competition, that they can be quite cagey, and that's kind of what you want to avoid. So if you can keep the bait moving through freely, you'll get that opportunity by just changing up the shot here and there. There is a lot of guesswork involved in it. The less amount of casts you make into a swim, the better, because you don't want to be casting in 3, 4, 5 times before you've actually worked out what the optimum weight is, because by that point, if there's a barbel in the swim and it's seen that bait coming through either far too quick and up in the water column or far too slow and dragging the bottom, quite often the barbel over a period of time will have determined that actually, no, that's not behaving properly. I'm not having it. At the end of the day, that's what rolling meat is. It's just trying to spark a reaction out of a fish, and if that reaction isn't sparked in the first couple of passes through, quite often that can mean that it's not going to happen. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it certainly is something that I've experienced over the years. Baits you can use obviously tin stuff. You've also got stuff that you can purchase in trays as well. Mostly the stuff that's in trays is flavoured. Say for example, something like the sauce luncheon meat. You know, if you're going to be fishing this sort of bait, it's probably more on the static side of fishing for the barbel, whereas if you're using something like bacon grill, which is slightly tougher, this bait here is obviously better for rolling meat, because it's not as oily, and it doesn't seem to break as much as, say, Spam, for example, which obviously is probably just as expensive as gold. This stuff has just got an extraordinarily expensive to purchase, and you imagine on a good trip I can go through probably one of these tins in 8 baits, sometimes even 4. I know it sounds a bit overkill, but if you're trying to get away from the smaller fish and trying to get something a bit bigger, I can probably get only 4 baits out of that, and you think at £2, £2.20 for the small tin, you know, it can be quite an expensive trip. Whereas something like this will stay on longer, and I could probably get 8 to 12 baits out of this, so it gets a little bit, the economics are a bit better on these. But they all have their place, and obviously with these as well, if you're fishing static, the oil content and the scent of these two here will certainly fare better. So what we're going to move on to now, very briefly, is just actually how I hook up luncheon meat whilst I actually do my rolling meat. So just if by magic, I've got my rolling meat rod here. I normally use an 8 or a 10-pound fluorocarbon link just for the first 1.5 foot. That's just in case if obviously, say for example now where the river is actually really clear, it's not usually this clear, so the fish might be a little bit more cagey. So trying to keep a fluorocarbon hook link on there just means you try and keep that as inconspicuous as possible. The size hook doesn't necessarily matter unless obviously you want to fish really small bits of meat. I don't. I tend to like using something that's around about 1 inch square. Some people gnaw the corners off so that it rolls a little bit more freely down. I do that sometimes, but today, just for the purpose of this, I'm not going to. So what I do is I actually don't use a hair rig, I use a band puller. They will have a slightly wider gape on the top there, so you can actually pass the hook of that through the actual hook of the meat, and then you can just basically pass it straight through and pull it through. For so many years before using this, I just used to just force it through, and quite often where the thickness of the meat was bigger than that of the hook, couldn't actually get hold of the bend to actually pull it up. And then my very, very, very cheap bait stop, when it comes to luncheon meat, I just get a bit of twig, stick it in there at an angle as well as the hook point. I don't have it flat normally, so I can have as much stickier as I can, and run it diagonally like that, and then just put a little bit of tension on there, and that just locks that in. And I should get anything from 10 to 30 casts on that. And as you can see, that sits nicely there. Very simple, been done by many, many people over the years. Very, very, very good tactic to find in Barbel, but also learn in the river as well.